So welcome everyone. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's Bushfire Climate and Local Government Roundtable. I'm David Craven, I'm the Director of the Cities Power Partnership, which is Australia's largest network of local governments taking action on climate change. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our program, we have over 125 councils from around the country who we assist to realise their climate and energy goals. Before we get started, I've just got a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to cover. If you haven't already, can you please update your name to include your organisation? All you need to do is to click on the three dots at the top right-hand side of your screen and select the rename option. Given the number of people we've got attending today, I'd ask that you please keep yourself on mute at all times. That'll make it easier for us to hear our panellists. And if you do have a question for the panellists that you haven't submitted in advance, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to add in your question, and we'll do our best to get through all of the questions. Unfortunately, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to do that. It just depends on really on the amount that we get coming through. We will do our best. We're running this event because intensifying climate change is driving Australia's escalating bushfire threat, creating longer and more dangerous fire seasons than ever before. And of course, Tasmania is no exception to that. As the ongoing Bushfire Royal Commission looks into a variety of issues, including climate change, hazard reduction and such, we're hosting this roundtable as an opportunity for local governments and stakeholders to come together to share knowledge, learn and get your questions answered. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today. When we initially started planning this event, it was actually prompted by Huon Valley Council, and we were proposing to do it as a face-to-face. And of course, things have changed considerably since then, but we still want to acknowledge Huon Valley's role in instigating it. So I'd like to hand over to Mayor Beck Enders to give us a little bit of background and welcome us all to the event. So over to you, Beck.
Thanks so much, David. Yes, good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Cities Power Partnership for hosting this webinar. I'd also like to thank you for taking the time to attend. I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm meeting on the land of the Malacadee people, the traditional custodians of this land. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that you're meeting on today and pay my respects to their customs, their elders, past, present and emerging. As David pointed out, the Huon Valley Council did engage with the Cities Power Partnership to host a webinar, and that was on the back of the 2019 bushfires in the Huon Valley. The bushfires, they hit our community really hard. And at the time, there was a lot of mixed information about hazard reduction, whose role it was, and also how effective it is. And through this webinar, we hope to gain information and a perspective on that. Our community needs to hear this information, councils need to hear this information, and other stakeholders in Tasmania do as well. And no doubt, you're all watching here, so you probably share the same as me, that we're all living in a new era. We know that with climate change, there's intense bushfire seasons. And the start of them is starting earlier and they're lasting longer. And so it's really important for Tasmanians to understand and bring to the forefront that this is actually something we need to deal with in the future. And the future is here right now. And local government is at the forefront. And so in the response phase, we see the immediate social impact of bushfire disasters and emergencies. And that is mental health, PTSD, respiratory issues relating to smoke inhalation, housing and emergency accommodation in a country where housing shortage is already an issue. We already know that it takes 2 to 3 years for good mental health to return. And there's a lasting impact from these disasters. Exhaustion takes over for residents, emergency services and leaders, continually moving from high to catastrophic ratings backwards and forwards. And in the Huon Valley, we constantly heard the Tasmanian Fire Service and our local fire brigades, people who've had generations of fighting fires in the Huon Valley. And the words that they continually said was that these fires are unpredictable. We've never seen anything like it ever here in the Huon Valley. And at the time, there were 50 fires burning in Tasmania. So as a leader at the back of your mind the whole time, you're thinking, what happens if fires break on the mainland? What happens to our resources? How how reduced will they be as a result of that? What will be the impact on our people, but also on our community assets? And the recovery phase is just even longer, and the economic impact just drags on. Even after the 2019 bushfires and prior to COVID breaking out, our tourism industry still hadn't recovered. The environment is an obvious one. We lost a lot of our old forest growth that we really cherish. Lots of wildlife perished and the habitat has changed in some areas. There's a significant cost to ignoring climate change science, and we know that these incidences will grow. And all levels of government working together in an emergency and response recovery, which we see every time there is an emergency. It works so well with the multiple tier level as well, working with not-for-profits in the private sector during these high-level emergencies. But we need to translate that. We need to make the same commitment to collaboration, and the same sense of urgency needs to be applied to climate change. And we know that councils, we need to work together across Tasmania to help our community to understand and to plan and respond to the increased bushfire risk. So we hope that this platform can really help that process and start that conversation. Thank you, and thanks, David.
Thank you, Mayor Anders. Well, let's get underway. I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to take a look at the interviews with our expert panel that we made available last week, but no need to worry if you haven't. We'll continue to make that available as a resource if you'd like to come back to it after the event today. We'll get started with some questions for each of our expert panellists from us, and then move into questions from you. Thanks to those of you that sent in questions in advance. We'll certainly make sure we get to those. And if you do have a question that comes up for you during the course of this event, please make sure you post it into the chat, and we're monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get to it as we move through. So now I'd like to introduce our panel for today. Firstly, Mike Brown. Mike spent 39 years working with the Tasmanian Fire Service. His roles range from operations, brigade management, district and regional management, and chief operating officer and chair of the State Fire Commission for more than 6 years, where he led Australia's only fully integrated fire and emergency service of 5,500 members. At a national level, Mike served as a director of the Australian Fire and Emergency Services Authorities Council, chair of the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, and as the deputy president of the Australasian Road Rescue Organisation. We also have Professor David Bowman. David is the University of Tasmania's Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science, and the Director of the Fire Centre Research Hub School of Natural Sciences, who has done an extensive amount of work and research exploring the relationship between fire, landscape and humans. He co-authored the textbook Fire on Earth, an introduction, and is leading the pack globally in this complex field. John Fisher. John is currently the manager at Bushland for the City of Hobart, with responsibilities for the 4,700 hectares of reserve and all of the recreational, educational, fire and biodiversity management of these areas. John has a long career in fire and environmental management across the eastern seaboard of Australia. He's worked in threatened species conservation in Victoria and New South Wales, incorporating fire management and biodiversity conservation with New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Deputy GM for New South Wales Forests. John has served as Deputy Chief Officer for the ACT Rural Fire Service and Superintendent as a Regional Manager for the Queensland Fire and Rescue Service in Central Queensland. Overall, 35 years of active fire management as a public land fire manager and professional firefighter. Dr. Rebecca Harris. Dr. Harris is a Senior Lecturer in Climatology in the discipline of Geography and Spatial Science and the Director of the Climate Futures Program. Rebecca has over 20 years of research experience, and her principal research interests are in the area of conservation management and climate change impacts on natural and human systems. Dr. Harris integrates climate science with ecological research to contribute to landscape management decisions that are necessary to adapt to climate change impacts. Recent research has focused on the impact of climate variability and extreme events on natural ecosystems and the adaptability of species and humans to change. And finally, Dr. Tom Remenyi. Dr. Remenyi is a Climate Research Fellow and part of the Climate Futures Program at the University of Tasmania. His work is focused on converting leading-edge scientific research into relevant and usable information for decision makers. His training in economics, analytical chemistry, marine biogeochemistry, data analysis and interpretation, as well as field sampling and project management, enable him to bring different skills to the various teams he works within and across a range of disciplines. He dedicates significant time to stakeholder engagement. He's a member of a number of committees and working groups and is a regular workshop facilitator. He also provides the technical expertise for services such as data provision, analysis, presentation and interpretation for stakeholders and within the Climate Futures team. So with that, we'll move into some questions for our panellists. David, I'd like to start with you if I could. In brief, can you talk to the role of climate change and its influence on the longer and more intense bushfire seasons we're experiencing, like in the 2018-19 Tasmanian fires and more recently in the 2019-20 Black Summer fires on the mainland?
The question of climate change driving fires is, on the one hand, a very sort of obvious question because we are on a warming planet, but on the other hand, it's also a very complicated and fraught question, the question of attribution of individual fire events to climate change, because just because you're having extreme fire weather doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting extreme fires. You have to have ignitions as well. And the impacts and magnitude of the fires are going to be affected by human behaviour, particularly ignitions critically, but also the way we've prepared the landscape, prepared our settlements and so on. So on the one hand, I would say it's a no-brainer that, we're living in a warming world. We're seeing, particularly say the Black Summer fires, as they're now being called, an extraordinary drought, change in rain-bearing winds, resulted in a fire event that was really outside even what the fire modelling community would have thought was possible, actually. And so a lot of climate modellers have got the tail between their legs. There's a very interesting opinion piece in Nature Climate Change saying, it's a fiery wake-up call to climate change modelling. There's something of such extraordinary scale, but by the same token, simple attribution of climate change to that event, it's a little bit more complicated because of the effect of fuels, ignitions. So the question and I'm involved in the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry, the question that we're grappling with is, could it have been worse? It could have been potentially much worse. Parts of Sydney could have been burnt down quite seriously had the ignition patterns been different. And in that case, it probably would have been the human ignition patterns. So it's something that we've got to bear in mind, that we don't look for a perfect prophecy. What we're needing to be is preparing ourselves for change, but also to understand that we're going to be seeing surprises, probably bad surprises like we saw this last summer.
Right, thanks, David. Mike, you've had a 39-year career as a firefighter. Can you speak to how you've seen the nature of bushfires change over the years and how the issue of hazard reduction relates to that?
Yeah, thanks, David. So in terms of what I can remember, it goes back even beyond 39 years. I remember a very significant event in 1967 when we had the Black Tuesday fires in Tasmania, where 67 people died, 2,000 homes were lost, all in the space of really just one afternoon. We had an extreme weather event. The one thing that was quite a bit different then is that we had very few controls over fire starts. So I think the subsequent inquiry reported that there were in excess of 100 fires that were burning on properties across the state for the purposes of agricultural burning or clearing land. So since then, and as a result of that inquiry, the permit system came in and there was more control over that. But I still recall earlier in my career, it wasn't unusual. I lived on the eastern shore of Hobart to look across at many times during the year, but particularly in the spring and the autumn, and see little columns of smoke around the foothills of Mount Wellington. And people were burning off. There wasn't too much objection to it. And although we had fires like 67 that were major fires and catastrophic by nature and damage done, they were much less frequent then. They were almost once in a generation. But then through, I guess from about the 80s, it just became a bit more frequent. We were getting bad fires probably once a decade. And then as I reflect back after I retired a few years ago, the decade or 15 years before that, we'd had significant fires on 3 or 4 different occasions. So 2013, as a result of extreme to catastrophic fire weather that impacted on, in particularly Dunalley in the southeast of the state, and Bicheno. And then later in 2016, we had the western part of Tasmania, which is normally very wet, particularly dry, and in many areas the driest it was on record. And we had major fires break out there and do, as a result of lightning, by the way, and do significant damage to World Heritage areas and areas of a very fire-sensitive nature, so alpine species and rainforest species. And then, of course, as Beck alluded to earlier, the big fires of 2019, which were very big in terms of scale, and again started by lightning, and with 200,000 hectares burned across the fire season, the biggest on record in terms of the fires we've had. But so far as fuel reduction goes, I just see there's been a whole lot more obstacles reducing the window available and the opportunity available to do fuel reduction. And back in the 80s, it was about wood chipping, because it became a big industry in the state, and the wood chip companies did not want charcoal on the wood before they chipped it, and that did have an impact. Then we had things like tourism and events become more popular in the state, and people with out enjoying the open places that we have in Tasmania. Tourism operators, of course, didn't want smoke impacting on their facilities and the tourism events that they had going on, and other events through the summer like marathons and boat festivals and things like that. People did not want a backdrop of smoke to those sorts of things. And then came the wine industry, which really 30 years ago wasn't there. But to the wine industry to have smoke taint near the time of harvesting grapes was particularly problematic too. So it's just become harder and harder to do the fuel reduction. And then the weather window to make it right has become more difficult because of the conditions we've been experiencing.
Thanks, Mike. A question for you, Beck. Could you tell us more about your work looking at how the ecology of bushfires is changing and will continue to change into the future as a result of climate change, and how that will impact communities that have not historically been so exposed to bushfire risk in Tasmania?
Sure. When I first started working at UTAS, I was asked to tell us what's going to happen with fire activity in the future. And I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And then, of course, I ended up realising very quickly, as Dave said, that actually, you know, there are some relatively easy bits, even though they're quite difficult, so the climate side of things. But then the really hard bit are what's actually happening on the ground with natural communities, with the fuel load and forest types and so forth. So my work in the Climate Futures and with colleagues sort of started off by, you know, looking at the changing fire weather using the regional climate models so that we can start to look at those changes that are expected out to the future. And we looked at the changing window of opportunity for prescribed burning. Another colleague, Pete Love, has looked at changing ignition potential, and interestingly has sort of found that actually the ignition potential doesn't necessarily increase into the future. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing lightning events that are now striking bone dry surfaces. And so we're getting ignitions perhaps more often than we might have in the past. And so then the other parts of my work has looked at trying to look at changing vegetation communities, because that obviously affects fuel load and flammability across the landscape. And so I've sort of done that in a couple of ways. I've looked at trying to, again, simplify it and look at just changing productivity for different types of plant types. And those results show that, you know, at the moment, obviously, we've got most of Tasmania is suitable for cool temperate forests, conifers and things like that, except with some exceptions in some of the drier parts of the state. But as we go further forward into the future, that suitability is going to change so that it's going to move towards more suitability for tropical temperate species and eucalyptus species. And obviously that has really important implications for fuel growth across the year and seasonally. And then obviously that affects flammability. So the other thing I've looked at is trying to look at the changing distribution of particular species. And I've looked at a range of eucalyptus species, which make up the sort of dominant species in a lot of the forests across Tasmania. And again, getting back to what Dave was saying, really what we can say is we can't say for sure what's going to happen, but we can say that we're going to be seeing change. So for example, I've modelled the difference between two eucalyptus species, which show directly contrasting responses to changing climate suitability. And it makes sense because it reflects their current suitability. So for example, Eucalyptus delicatensis is projected or expected to sort of slightly contract around the coast as we go forward into warmer, drier Tasmania world and move further up slope. And in contrast, Eucalyptus obliqua is expected to actually sort of expand quite a bit, and particularly in the southwest. So exactly when that might happen, we don't know, but what the modelling suggests is that we are going to be seeing change and shifts in species composition, ecosystem structure, probably ecosystem function, and that is going to be something that we're going to have to consider when we're thinking about managing for increasing bushfire risk as we go into the future. And I think that it's interesting actually also because a lot of that sort of work is based on trying to model changes in the mean climate trend. But actually, as we're seeing already, it's actually the changes in the extreme events that are really going to drive a lot of those natural communities. And while a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been quite sort of theoretical and modelling, we're actually now seeing this play out in real life. So unfortunately, we're seeing that all of the things that people, the theory suggests is starting to happen. And again, as Dave said, it's happening faster than anyone really expected. So we're seeing those really extreme bushfires that are coming into vegetation communities that historically would rarely have seen fire. You know, they might have seen a fire every 300 or 400 years, and that would have given them time to recover, perhaps. So that's examples, you know, for example, in alpine communities, the Wilderness World Heritage Area, so the pencil pines that are fire sensitive and don't recover after even just one fire. So we're really seeing those examples already. So on top of the sort of widespread mortality of dominant species in response to heat waves and droughts, you would just need those sort of massive bushfires to come through, and you're talking about massive change and quite abrupt change. So as Beck said, the point is that we are seeing it now, and it's no longer something that we can just put off for the future to think about.
And in terms of that sort of change of, you talked about the two species and one retracting and one kind of growing in its environment. Do they have a difference in terms of their flammability, in terms of, I guess the way that impacts bushfire risk, or is that just sort of simply changing kind of habitat?
I'm not actually sure, David. I haven't really stopped to think about that, because I think it's, a lot of these modelling, these things are going to happen quite, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in one way, the models assume that change will happen quite slowly, but there's a lot going on the ground as well. So, you've got competition between species. So just because the species climate is suitable doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be able to move. On the other hand, again, when we see these extreme events, we end up with an open slate. So when you have a really hot fire that wipes out the dominant species, you've then got the opportunity for quite fast change or dispersal into a system. Unfortunately, that's perhaps going to be driven more by invasive species, because they tend to be the generalists that can get in there quick smart. And personally, I think that's something we're really going to have to look at in terms of maintaining or managing our forests into the future, is those abrupt changes where we end up with a shift in ecosystem state in effect.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Beck. Tom, could you tell us more about the conversations you've been having with councils about proactively managing from climate hazards such as bushfires? Are councils embracing this risk lens, and what needs to be done at other levels of government to support them?
So I guess in direct response, the councils are embracing the risk lens. It is a lens that allows them to operate within their kind of purview of operations. And it does allow you to take it from a kind of conceptual idea to and a strategic idea to actually like feeding it all the way down to operations and what you do on the ground. So the risk, managing it from a risk perspective is something that does work for councils and does allow them to feed it into different parts of their operations and their tactical and strategic decision making. Particularly like in Tasmania, the big ones and as it says in the Tasmania State Natural Disaster Risk Assessment, it's fire and flood that are the two biggest things that Tasmanians need to manage. There has been some nation-leading work in coastal inundation as well, and that's some very, very small but targeted areas around the state that need some work, but those councils are working on that, such as Kingborough Council, Hobart City Council, and over in Mornington. So they've been working on that and trying to develop ways to adapt to that. It's actually the biggest challenge is that adaptation step. How do you get people along that adaptation journey? And that comes back to really you need to have really strong leadership inside the councils to achieve that, because it's a really hard road. And what I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my presentations are actually about convincing people that climate change is real. That's a really big part of my presentations. Almost wherever I give the presentation, there are lots of people who are like, oh yeah, I know it's a bit of a big deal, but they haven't realised that they have to, that as Beck Enders said, the time to take action is now. It's no longer into the future. It's no longer our grandkids. Yes, they will be dealing with problems of climate change, but we are dealing with problems of climate change now. And when I talk to local councils, that's a really big mental shift of moving into that kind of like it's an immediate threat, not a future threat. And the big thing that's really changed that has been the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has come out of the International Financial Stability Board. And they've started to say, we will only invest in companies, we will only lend money to organisations, we will only insure organisations that understand their climate-related risk and have strategies and operational responses in place to mitigate or adapt to those climate-related risks. And that's been a fundamental shift. And that came out in June 2017. It's really allowed those people that maybe are more sort of driven by economic realities, it's really been a point where they can engage with the climate-related risks and the disclosures that they need to do and understand that this has an economic impact. If your insurance goes like doubles because you're not able to identify what your climate risks are, that's a big impact on an organisation. And so that's been really where it's moved away from what you believe, and it's now about this is the operational market-driven response that councils need to respond to. And that's been a really big shift, and that's happened sort of really over the last 2 to 3 years. And even some people, I've identified some people that have said, wow, I was wrong. I have been a climate denier for a long time and I was wrong. And they are now quite proactive in what they are trying to implement across their councils now. And so there's a lot of momentum. So I'll leave it there for the moment, but yeah, that's what our discussions are all about and what's happening on the ground now.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen the TCFD work starting to impact in the corporate sector, but you know, from your experience, you're actually starting to see that flow through now into the council, local government perspective as well, sort of actively embracing that.
Yeah, but I'd say that they were actually the councils that have been on top of climate change were actually the first movers. They were doing this well before TCFD was released. But what the TCFD has done is it's actually helped to overcome some of those barriers to implementing change inside councils. It's provided those people that have identified this risk and have been trying to get action on the ground inside councils to say, hey, look, I have been correct for a very long time. Can you please support this? And given them another lever to work with. And but I can't emphasise enough how much Hobart City Council, Kingborough Council, Clarence councils have been world leaders in trying to implement change and to take into account climate change in their operations. And they have done that despite of some of those barriers that they have inside their own council as well. And so we do have the capacity in Tasmania to take on some of these big challenges and to help local councils learn from each other. And Beck Enders has been helping to coordinate those efforts, help to share the information that's been developed by those other leading councils, and with those that maybe have fewer resources or maybe are only just now really transitioning to understanding the importance. But I just want to emphasise that councils have not been necessarily dragging their feet as a whole, and some have actually been leading organisations in this space.
Yeah, it's really great to hear. And I just wondered, it sounds like there's a kind of coordination or like a role for the state government to play to provide maybe some kind of framework to extend that thinking, to help extend that thinking to all councils across Tasmania and I guess across Australia. Do you see a role for state or federal government in that space?
Oh, absolutely. But I think it's more across, like it's a collaborative effort that needs to be across all sectors, private, public, university, all levels of government. The collaboration just needs to be across the board. And every level has its own role to play. Like some things, implementation of some things are going to be better managed and better done at the local level by local council. And that's been demonstrated in the past with a whole bunch of different programs that have been rolled out. But then some, local councils are there to implement state laws. So it needs to have a state lens, and the state needs to have a certain amount of leadership. And similarly, the federal government is required to have some leadership as well, where they have a particular role to play. And so really lining up all of those efforts is crucial to building a national capability in responding to this climate change challenge.
Thanks, Tom. This is probably a good opportunity to actually throw to one of the local governments that you mentioned, John Fisher, over to you at the City of Hobart. The state government relies on local government to be on the front line of response, but not all councils enjoy the level of resourcing that Hobart has, perhaps. What is the opportunity for local government to take a leading role in innovative fire management practices, and what sorts of additional resources need to be committed in order for this to happen across all Tasmanian councils, do you think?
I think you're right. Tom's made a few points there in relation to the, I suppose, the learnings that occur every time we have a major incident, and COVID-19 is teaching us all lessons at the moment. I think that in reality, local government has sort of been left out of the discussion to a large degree, because a lot of instances we've talked about response to the current situation, whether it be the coming fire season or what we do different to last year's fire season. And I think that local government, I've always said, are the only level of government that stands in the room before, during, and after the incident, and therefore it has a long-term commitment to the community, and it articulates with the community at a local level. And there is some real reality checks of recent events that has taught us, I think, that councils need to, in a range of forums, whether it be planning forums or whether it be in discussions with communities or vulnerable groups, to take the lead of articulating the information that we have that's provided both state and federally, and perhaps even from places like Tom's group UTAS and Dave Bowman's group to articulate it in a way that makes sense to people on the ground. I see that as the real role of local government. And I think a lot of local governments, as Beck from Hewan has said, as the Mayor said, it's a bit of a slap in the face when all of a sudden these things happen on your patch in your local government area and you're running around with all your staff trying to deal with the impact on the community. And then everyone goes away and greatly appreciative of the work that they've done, both national and international resources, whatever it might be for firefighting, but they go and you're left with the aftermath, the recovery, which can take quite a long time. I think there's the role of council is looking at what legacy decisions have been made in the past, and state government's support for that is really about, I think, fundamentally changing the way that we deal with planning laws and, importantly, rights to property rights to continue with developments which were made or decisions were made, could be a decade ago, that haven't been progressed and now are relying upon a very old approval, land use planning approval, that will exacerbate the problems that we're now encountering. And I think there's a real need for state government to support local government in that. There will be compensation for that. But when you look at the billions of dollars that we'll spend in trying to deal with the aftermath, the spending that money prior to the event or to the climate change impacts we're going to have, to pull people out of those affected areas. And as Tom referred to, climate change, sea level rise and flooding events are making it clear that there are places where we should not have built houses. So we're in a bit of an issue with that. I think there's a real opportunity, I think, for local government, I suppose, to make future decisions, to bring those to the fore, to be bold, I suppose. It doesn't cost you a great deal of money, but what it does do is to make people aware of the fact that, and we're doing this in Hobart, we're saying to people now, if your house burns down in the area that you're currently built, under the current Australian standard 3959, you will not be able to build on that block of land again. So you need to have a think about, if you want that property to, if you want to live in this location with that view in that forested environment, you need to do something to protect your house, because your right to develop that location again may no longer exist under the current planning laws. And I think local government relies upon state government support to make those hard decisions for people. And I think we're very lucky in Hobart in that our elected members clearly see bushfire risk and flooding, because we had the event in 2018 and probably COVID-19 as well, pandemic. They see those as clear roles for local government, and even in the budget constraints we've got now, our funding particularly for bushfire protection has not been reduced in our current significant budget challenge. So I think it's an integration, it's an articulation at local government level into a language that people locally understand, and local government can do that.
Thanks, John. David, another question for you. You've said that you see local government as the sleeping giant of the global fire crisis. What role do you see for local government in trialling or piloting new innovative solutions to adaptive fire management?
That's right. So just to sort of summarise what I think I've heard the other speakers say, really there's a three-way tension between dollars, the available resources to do things, the power to do those things, and the community support to do those things. You put those three things together, you can actually start adaptation. And I think I'd really like to emphasise here the gear change from talking about adaptation to adaptation. That is the moment we are in now. We have to stop talking about adaptation. We've got to start doing adaptation. But that three-way tension is a real challenge for local government, but I hope that it isn't overwhelming for them. And what do I mean? Well, a local government could say, well, we just don't have the financial resources, the dollar signs. But perhaps there are innovative ways where those resources can be procured. And one way might be cutting out the middleman and going to the Commonwealth and saying, look, we are actually the seat of adaptation. And possibly something good could come from the Royal Commission, or certainly heightened awareness that the Commonwealth is putting its hand up now to be involved basically in local issues. That's what that was an avowed expression. When they involved themselves with the Royal Commission, that's what they're doing. They're buying into land management, which is historically a really significant step. With the power that local government has, I think it's really underestimated that the planning, the control, the regulation, the rates, with maybe putting some legal scrutiny to those powers, there are probably some pretty effective ways, as John was suggesting, to incentivise adaptation at the landholder if it's an implied threat or actually a threat. You know, using the powers to say you're living in a fire hazard, or if your house burns down because you've chosen to live in a fire hazard, guess what? You're not going to be able to rebuild. Now, of course, you know, there are political issues which will surround that, but normally the default position after a fire disaster is to immediately rebuild, and you know, who cares about the regulations, because we want that expression. But I think that the third and the critical element of what I'm talking about is the community. That, as others have said, there's really no other branch of government that is so community, so place focused as local government. And I think empowering, energising rather than demoralising the community to adaptation, that can have two things can happen by doing that. One is you can get outcomes immediately. You know, why don't we help people clean up their yards? Why don't we help people get to be fire compliant? Why don't we give incentives, you know, rate incentives, or at least free advice or subsidised advice, so people can get up to speed? Because the real, you know, horrible reality here is that in all of this discussion about adaptation and the need to start adaptation, there's something which is a sort of an open secret, and that is non-compliance. Basically, we're not even playing by our own rules, let alone inventing new rules. We are not playing by our own rules. It's a schmozzle. Go onto Google Earth and go and have a look at what the BAL ratings are, or what the advice of defendable space is from TasFire, and it's a joke. It's just a joke. You know, just go and look at a lot of suburbs. So how can we live with ourselves if we know there's non-compliance? Well, we need, rather than to be angry at the community, to bring the community on that journey to become compliant, and to enable them not to, and empower them not to demoralise them, not to be angry at them. Now, there are schemes and incentives. I know of one in California where simple things like having, we'll remove your green debris for free, or we'll have a chipper in this suburb to help you clean up your mess. You know, so incentivising and helping. But the second benefit, I think, of empowering the community is that it gives local government an extraordinary power base to push back against the state government and against the federal government or not push back, to make a very powerful claim for more resources. Because it's saying, look, we're actually doing the work on a shoestring. You're expecting adaptation. Well, how about handing over the real money? Because we're the agents of change. And if you can prove that and have the support of the community, that community also votes at a state level and a federal level. So I think that capacity building has two functions. One is it actually starts the adaptation process, but it also creates a political power base to activate the sorts of very rapid changes that we require. And without the community support, adaptation just isn't going to happen.
Thanks, David. Mike, it's local governments that continue to work with their communities once the bushfire is out and the fire services have moved on. What can be done to build a capacity, and how can local governments and state agencies best work together to achieve that?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, you make a good point. And going back from what John was saying there before, it's local government leadership that's there in a big way before, during and after the event. And I think fire services have been guilty of being very much involved in the during, and perhaps in the past less involved in the before and after. I think things have changed a bit. I think fire services are now involved in a bit more of the before, in the preparation and prevention stage, but things can improve a fair bit. So it just needs to be understood, I guess, that if our federal government was to turn the economy around to one with a reliance on renewable energy solutions into the future, and stopped the carbon emissions, if all that was to happen tomorrow, climate change has a huge amount of energy and inertia, and therefore we're still going to have this warming planet, but if we're to stop things, perhaps we won't have that temperature increase by the end of the century of 4, 5, 6 or 7 degrees higher than what it is now. But we know that we've got a problem now. It's got a lot of inertia, and we must do things to protect us for the next few decades anyway. So David was right. Adaptation is the key, and where local government has got a lot of potential and influence in that area, is they know and understand their communities, their people, better than any other tier of government. So we have the local government there with a lot of power to influence people, and because they know their communities well, we also know that how you approach and influence a community can be very different. So a community that's on the urban fringe of a city, a commuting community, if you like, is quite a bit different to how you might influence a farming community, to how you might influence a shack community, for example. And local government has all that information and all that knowledge. So when we have the larger agencies like Fire develop such programs as the Bushfire Ready Neighbourhoods program or the community protection planning process, there's a merging of the state government solutions with local government, so we get that understanding of how best to approach and influence the community. That's happening very well in some places. I think it's got more potential in others. So to date, and these programs have been in place for 5 or 6 years now, or probably slightly longer than that. They came out of the back of the Black Saturday fires in Victoria and the Royal Commission into that. They can and they have done a lot of good, but I think we've got to keep up that relationship, that partnership between local government and the state government agencies to ensure that that's going to have the best sort of benefit. So there's those couple of programs. They're good and they need to be enhanced. Things about planning and building regulations need to be reviewed, and that might be hard for councils because councils clearly get their income from rates, and yet, as John said, clearly there are places where we shouldn't have development, and that's a really, really tough call, because if an area is at considerable risk, say from fire, but it could be flood as well, to stop the development on that is a pretty, economically and socially, it's a pretty big call, and it's not quite as simple as it just being recognised as being bushfire prone, because I've seen places that we've known to be bushfire prone reduce that risk and their hazard because there's been the development. So it's not quite a simple solution as that. The other place where local government has some influence and some power, and I know in many places are doing good work, is in the hazard abatement area. So local governments has powers under the Local Government Act to reduce hazards. So they take a responsible approach with their own parks and reserves, but also on private properties, they're able to recognise fire hazards on private property and issue a hazard abatement notice on that property. And in fact, if the property owner doesn't comply with that, then the local government authority can arrange a contractor to do it and bill with the rates the private property owner for that. Now, the difficult thing for some of the smaller councils is they don't employ people with a bushfire management responsibility. But I know from certainly in my days, we would work with councils to help them in the recognition of fire hazards on private property. They were the main ones there, and I think the other is as we're getting into a climate that's becoming far more challenging, some local government agencies have developed refuges for communities to take refuge in, should it be a fire event or a flood event, and others not so much. So there's probably a case for some local government authorities to get on the front foot with that and discuss with the authorities about the risk in their area and where and how and what sort of capacity they should be providing in the development of such refuges, which doesn't have to be a new facility, by the way. It could be a school or a hall or something like that. But these sorts of things, as the Huon Valley certainly know, become pretty important under such conditions.
Thanks, Mike. I don't know if anyone else from the panel wants to add anything to that question at all. No? Okay, we'll keep moving then.
Yeah, I'd love to add something there. How can we build capacity to respond better? One of the key things that has been demonstrated, and it's been something that I think has been wonderful about what's been happening during the COVID-19, is the awareness of mental health and the importance of understanding the impacts of these catastrophic events to people's mental health. And one of the key ways of making sure people are more resilient and more capable of responding to major events is letting them be aware that these things are going to happen. The difference between saying you might be hit by a bushfire versus there is going to be a bushfire. So what are the things that you would do if there was a fire that was burning and it was coming down the hill and it was about to hit your house in 2 hours' time? What would you do? Well, how about if you knew that was going to happen in 24 hours' time? How about if you knew it was going to happen in a month's time? This is something John Fisher's taught me, actually. I'm just basically paraphrasing him. The importance that has on people's mental capacity to respond and recover after an event when they've already accepted that my house is going to burn down. My house is going to be flooded. And then once you accept that, then when it happens, you're not surprised it happened, and you've already thought about what you were going to do when it did happen. And that is a really, really important part of how local council, state government, federal government, the various authorities can really improve the resilience of our communities, is just by stepping from that, not even thinking about it will never happen to me, moving towards it might happen to me, to it is going to happen to us. And once everyone's accepted it is going to happen to us, it changes the way people make decisions. And that's a really important part of the discussion. And I think the authorities at all levels are doing a great job of promoting that message. We've got a long way to go, but I think we're on the right path in that context.
And David, I think Tom makes a really good point there. I mean, it's part of my shock and awe campaign. I think that I've marched through the city, from elected members and the Lord Mayor down to people who live in Ferntree. But the reality check, that when you say to people, what in your house can you not live without if it burns to the ground? And ask people to go around and, pull them out of their cupboards or pull them off the wall, whatever it might be, and put them in a pile, and then have a look and say, well, when you've got an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, to gather these absolutely essential items that you have into your Subaru Forester or whatever it might be, and then go with it, is that really, is it really possible for you to do that? And it's really interesting. People do that, then they have a think about it and reduce the volume of it. But having done that, they have, by conscious decision, given away all the things that they are not taking to safety. they won't mourn they will mourn them, but they won't feel tragic loss because they made a conscious decision that I'm living in this area, in this house, in this bushfire prone area, and if this house burns down, I've saved the things that I wanted to save. That extends to the community as well. In a community where you have vulnerable people who might be elderly or frail, or have some health issues, etc., the community making that same assessment. What am I going to do? How is Mr. What's his name down the road going to survive in an event when it happens? How do we as a community support them rather than relying upon the government or the fire service or the police to come and evacuate them? I might just have to go down the day before or that morning and say to this elderly couple, do you need a ride into your sister's place in the city? Or would you like to come and stay with me for the afternoon? Or I'm going to my brother-in-law's place in Taroona or whatever it might be. Why don't you come with me and we'll have a cup of tea or whatever it might be. The level of community engagement to address the problem is much greatly strengthened when people accept that it is going to happen. And I found that as a really strong message to the community that's likely to be affected, because they take real action and they have a real plan that addresses those things that matter to them most. Not only their photos of their children or whatever it might be, but their neighbours or their pets or their community. So there's a much more of a sociological analysis of what can be done that I think local government and the fire services acting together can actually achieve quite impressive outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's really interesting, and we've definitely seen, not obviously in the same way, but with COVID-19, that kind of real deepening, I think, of local community connections and care in the community for others. And it'll be in the same way, I guess, we've been talking about observing the science under COVID and climate change. In the same way, I think there'll be some learnings from this period of COVID response to the sorts of things you're talking about. I might move on to Beck now, if I can. Beck, understanding that local councils have rather tight budgets in Tasmania, but I think all over Australia at the moment, they're all feeling the effects of COVID, certainly in the immediate term. Where and how could we begin to generate local conversations and action? Where would you start?
Well, it's interesting because I think actually we have started, and I think that all the previous comments show that we've started. I do acknowledge that we've got to stop talking about adapting and actually start doing it, and I think that is a really hard thing. But I think actually with bushfire, it is one of the examples where we have started to see some adaptation, some local communities getting prepared. As Mike said, I think from conversations with various people in the Tasmanian Fire Service, it has been getting better in terms of getting local conversations happening over the last few years with the community engagement programs and bushfire preparedness programs of different sorts. So I think that as this is not adding anything new to the conversation, I think that really that importance of conversations from the local council to the fire services and the state government obviously is really important. I think it's also really important to keep the conversation happening all the time, because people have short memories. So even though in Beck Ender's area people are obviously still reeling from the fires of a couple of years ago, it's amazing how quickly we just move on and we start to forget that message that this could happen and probably will happen at some point depending on where I'm living. So I think we just have to have that conversation frequently. And I feel like I'm not really the right person to be having this conversation, because I think Beck and John and Mike are the ones who, really know how to have these conversations. And obviously, as Mike said, it's different for different communities. But I don't think it has to be really expensive, actually. I think that, there's lots and lots of opportunities for community fora to bring people together regularly to be talking about what their exposure is, to try and get some of that climate information out to them so that they're not being fed misinformation. But I think it's also really important to make sure that we have that conversation in the context of, in some cases, you'll be able to prepare your property and defend it. But in other cases, you're just not going to be able to, and that they're quite different conversations as well. But it is a difficult conversation, I think, because you don't want to just be terrifying people. As Dave said, you know, we want to be empowering them to take responsibility. I think in Tasmania, I've noticed in the last few years that there has definitely been a shift from, you know, the fire service will look after me, to I have to take responsibility for myself, my property and my family. And that's definitely been a shift that I've noticed in my area. So we have to just make sure that that really is there and repeatedly brought up, and with definite options of actions that you can take.
Thanks, Beck. Tom, you've talked about the limits to adaptive management practices and the need for local government to implement controls to facilitate more sensible building and development. And we've touched on this, I think, a little bit in the conversation already. Can you talk a little more to some of the challenges here and how the risk to, and the risk to councils, I guess, if they don't start to tackle this head on? And perhaps, is there an opportunity for a coordinated approach here?
It's absolutely an opportunity for a coordinated approach. I mean, you know, we need to coordinate it across the entire system, not just Tasmania, but I think we're very well positioned in Tasmania to have an example of how you can do it at a statewide basis. We've got a nice clear boundary which between us and the other states, and that makes it quite easy to understand who's in the tent and who's outside of the tent in that context. I think, you know, that's well utilised throughout the emergency services already. And I think being able to turn that into being much more in the preparation space and the planning space, and then also in the response space is what is being developed at the moment. But I think in terms of that, some of the things that I was thinking of as the discussion went on, local councils often have some of the limits to adaptation is like, you know, there are some things we cannot adapt to, and we shouldn't expect that there will be technological solutions that can do it. We need to think about retreat. We need to think about avoiding those locations. We need to think about how do we bring the community along where they understand that's the level of risk that you've got. And that's where I think coming to that point of like knowing it's a matter of when this particular hazard will occur, not if the hazard will occur, allows a lot of people to go, oh, well, I'm not willing to take that risk of I might be the one who actually gets hit by this hazard. And that allows them to start thinking about a retreat option. And when we had a similar presentation to this to the fern tree community, a number of people immediately after that decided to put their house on the market and move because they weren't willing to live with that risk anymore. They weren't capable of managing their property to the point which would make it safe. And so they made that choice. And I think we've got to make sure that when people are making these choices, they realise the level of risk that they're carrying if they choose to live in a dangerous place, for example. And, you know, the Black Saturday bushfires identified that, you know, bare ground was burning in some locations. You can't protect anything against that. It's bare ground and it's on fire. And that's a risk that you can't adapt to. There are lots of ecological risks that are hard limits like this as well. Particular amounts of warming means that certain species will be lost, and we need to recognise that these are things we can't adapt to. They are things that are going to happen, and there's a level of loss we need to understand. And as Beck said, this is our challenge, is balancing the doom and gloom against some of the hope of what we can do and the things we can save and the things that we can take control over. And it's really about trying to focus. People will respond more to hope than they will to doom. And I think we need to really try and make sure that language is there. I'm just trying to remember some parts of the question, but I think I'll leave it there for the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. And I guess that's a nice segue into John. I know, John, both you and Tom have mentioned Fern Tree and the work that you've done there. I just wondered, can you talk any more to the experience of working with that community and maybe some of the learnings that have come out of that you could share?
Yes, David. I'll look, and I mean, David, myself, and Tom were all at the Fern Tree event. And just to give you a background on that, you know, in a local government arrangement with a public meeting, you like to know how many people are going to come. You ask for RSVPs. I think we've got about 42. So we catered a light snack for 80 because we know that people don't necessarily RSVP. I think we ended up with over 140, all local residents. It was quite an amazing meeting to have people. You wouldn't be able to do it now in COVID-19. Sure as there was not 1.5 metres separation of distance, but people squashed into that small Fern Tree community hall, or where you could hear a pin drop when Tom and David were presenting their views of climate change impacts upon bushfire risk in Fern Tree. And I think it was a pivotal moment in terms of the engagement of the city and the fire services with that at-risk community, where we have very little opportunity to reduce risk through hazard reduction burning, but we were doing things out in the reserves. You know, the city now has over 50 hectares of reserve land cleared to establish bushfire attack level 29 for all of our nearby neighbours where their dwelling is within that prescribed distance. And we were doing that, and a couple of things come out of that. Gave the opportunity for people to understand the magnitude of the change and the magnitude of risk that was looming for people in, you know, bushfire-prone areas. It demonstrated that the UTAS, UTAS and TFS and ourselves were serious about it. It was a serious issue that we were trying to deal with. And from my perspective, at least from the council, that the council is actually doing something on our land to protect people. And that provided a couple of opportunities. It established the high moral ground for me as the then program leader, Fire and Biodiversity, to go to people and talk about what we were doing. The clear perception of council was, and probably others around the community, was that if we were to go into Fern Tree, into the wet, you know, the damp forests, temperate forests of Mount Wellington, and clear understory vegetation to reduce risk, then we were going to get a hell of a backlash from the community. We were going to be pilloried about clearing, particularly if we were going to do it with, you know, the machinery, etc., etc. And a lot of lead up to that. The community engagement meeting at Fern Tree was the sort of pivotal point of that. We undertook all that work in Fern Tree. We've still a little bit left to go. We've had one complaint in that event. In that project. And that complaint was that we didn't go far enough. Now, from a position of thinking that we were going to get green protests and people locked to machinery and you know banners and stuff like that, to the point where universally people understood what we were doing, universally applauded council taking that action to protect them. And I think in Fern Tree particularly, as Tom referred to, people understood that they had to take some action to make the work that we've done effective. And as Mike has said previously, the most important element of protecting yourself from bushfire risk is from your back door to the fence. And if you haven't done that, anything I've done is irrelevant. And it's been really, it's been an interesting journey of engaging through the bushfire ready neighbourhoods through the TFS, where I've once again done my shock and awe campaign and talked to people about what the reality is, what they're going to do. And when you say to people, well, the fire danger index of 50 is the measure at which the Australian standard 3959 fails to apply any further. Above that, your house might have been built 2 years ago according to Australian standard, but it still is not designed to withstand a fire that's in a fire danger index above 50. And that's a bit of a shock for people to understand, because they think, oh, well, I've done the right thing. I've got a bushfire plan and my house is cool. I'm going to survive here. But when you go through and actually unpick all of that, and they realise that their bushfire survival plan means leaving early in the morning before the fire even gets there, it's a real wake-up call to people about it. I think Fern Tree is an excellent example how a face-to-face discussion with people, honest, frank, and exposing them to the things that we know makes a real difference to the choices that they make. And I've been doing this in the Queensland Fire Service and the ACT New South Wales and that, you know, all my career, when I say to people, don't expect a truck to turn up to your front door and protect your house. It is not going to happen. We only have so many trucks. We've got 3 in your village, and they are not going to come to your place. They're going to have to drive past 55 burning houses to get to you. It ain't going to happen. The best thing you can do is tell your brigade that our house can burn. We won't be there, and don't risk your lives to go up there and protect our property, because it's not important. Life is our most, you know, thing. And you hear that every time. We hear that we heard that in 2003 or whatever it might be, or communities on the news where people say, it was dreadful, it was shocking, but at least no one was killed. And as a measure of success, I think that's the one principle that people apply to major disasters, that at least no one lost their life. And I think that engagement with people to take action has been really, and talk to David and Tom as well. It was a very impressive response from the community, who are well informed, share the knowledge that we have, and guide them in the decisions that they need to make, and let them get on with it. I think that's what we are a can-do society. We want to know, what can we do? People complain about the nanny state, etc. But in reality, in bushfire, it's what you do that makes a difference. And I universally have found that people respond positively when given a challenge, and they understand what they need to do. And some of that is the city now is looking at how we can provide advice, as Mike said, free advice to people on how they can retrofit their pre-2009 houses to meet BAL 29 standard under the Australian standard. If we can provide that advice to them, you know, and an indicative price, and you know, where they can get the material to do it, then I think people will take that action. And I think that's a really strong message. Engage with the community, co-opt with the community. Don't treat them like idiots, because at the end of the day, they will judge you after the event, and we know that.
Thanks, John. We're moving into the latter stages of our time now. We do have a few questions that have come through from the audience, so I'd like to move into some of those now. The first question is from Eve Lazarus from the Derwent Catchment Project, and this is directed to the panel in general. Eve has read Fire Country by Victor Stephenson and would like to know what your thoughts are on his message about the role of Aboriginal fire management. Maybe David, we'd start with you.
Yeah, so Victor's book is a really interesting book. It's not a science book, it's a personal journey of an Aboriginal man rediscovering a really important dimension of his culture from some Aboriginal mentors on Cape York, and Victor's leveraged that experience to argue that there's got to be much greater Aboriginal involvement in fuel management and conversion of what would be, he would consider overgrown or dysfunctional landscapes to become more fire resilient. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for what Victor's saying. And I think that there's a very exciting opportunity for local government to engage with the local Indigenous communities to promote the idea of fuel management, landscape design, because these are principles that have got an ancient history in Australia. It's a great way of, you know, practical reconciliation, honouring and recognising the prior management custodianship of the landscape. So there's some really important, valuable ideas. However, there are some very big caveats that I think we need to be honest about. The first caveat is that we can't allow fire management to become exclusively the domain of Aboriginal people. It's not fair to the Aboriginal communities. They haven't got the resources. The scale of this problem, we've just talked about a fire event this last summer where around 7 million hectares of eucalyptus forest were burnt on the east coast of Australia. So that's, you know, burning the entire island of Tasmania down several times over. And unfortunately, the scale of these fires we've seen escalating in Tasmania, about 250,000 hectares, 2018-19. 25% of the island's been burnt since the turn of the century by bushfires. So we're looking soon, I think, in Tasmania to probably some very major fires which are going to be extraordinarily destructive. Now, there just isn't the capacity in the Tasmanian Aboriginal community to mitigate that risk. So that's the first thing. We don't know how to do it equitably, to compensate Aboriginal people for their work, for their, in some cases, Indigenous ecological knowledge. So I'm much more of the view that a way out of this, which could potentially become incredibly polarising and a vortex that doesn't actually result in outcomes, but just results in political heat, is to go right up front and to say we need an affirmative action program. We need to acknowledge Indigenous people have a major stake in bushfire management. We need to encourage every land management agency, public, private, whatever level of government, to have a program to promote Aboriginal people's capacity to be involved in mainstream fire management, hybrid streams of fire management. And we also, if Aboriginal communities wish, should be probably funding, probably as a health intervention as much as a land management intervention and a social justice intervention, exclusively Indigenous programs that are just for Indigenous people to reconnect with their culture, because fire is so central. So there are some ideas that I've written about. I've had the support of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, the Indigenous, Greg Lehman. We wrote an article together in The Conversation articulating some of these ideas. So I'm not, just freelancing, talking on behalf of Indigenous people. I've tried to engage with this, but we've got to be really careful. My key caveat is don't get into wishful thinking that there's some solution and it's just a matter of Indigenous people doing their practice and the problem's going to go away. What we need to do is to find lots of value in what Indigenous fire management, bring Indigenous people and compensate them and respect them politically and financially, institutionally, through affirmative action programs and various other schemes, both in the public and also critically in private, NGOs, farms, all sorts of people. There are opportunities. I work with a farmer who has gone out of his way to employ the Aboriginal community to do some burning on his land as an expression of social justice and a recognition of prior ownership. So there's lots of scope here. I think Victor's book is really important. I think interpreted in a narrow way, I was going to say the wrong way, but in a narrow way, could result in a polarisation and a loss of opportunity. So I think as fire managers, we need, and people interested in fire management, we need to be on the front foot and start promoting opportunities for Aboriginal people to participate in the enormous adaptive management challenge that we face, and critically noting that we are now in a new environmental situation. So it's not simple restoration. It's not simply a matter of going back to 1788 and it's all going to be tinky boo. If you look at the climate of 1788, it is a very different climate to the climate of 2020.
Thanks, David. That's great. I'm conscious that we are starting to run a little short of time. So unless any other panelists really want to jump in there, I might just try and get another couple of questions in from our audience members. So Lisa Calthon from Glenorchy City Council has written, this is to you, Tom. In your interview, you spoke about the potential need to triage our natural values when it comes to bushfire and climate change. How do we pick what to protect or save during and after a fire? Lisa thinks this is a really interesting topic, one that's really useful for on-ground land managers, but keen to know what your thoughts are on how a triage system of natural and even cultural values could work in Tasmania when it comes to managing wildfire and fuel reduction burns. And do we know if this has been done elsewhere successfully, and who would be best placed to develop such a system? Tom.
First of all, I'm not an expert in this space. I'm just identifying a problem that needs to be solved by a social values expert, and a team of them. Wouldn't be just me. We do have methods where they identify and rank the natural and social values, cultural values that they manage across the landscape. So there is a system that has been developed over the last decade or so that could be used to help local councils in this space. So those things do exist. I think this is thinking about what are the values that we're going to lose is a discussion that is very hard. And it's a discussion that almost everybody wants to avoid. And so being able to say what's the solution is, well, we need to start identifying that it's a problem first. And moving forward from there, I'm hoping that, there are other people that understand how we trade off our different values of our landscapes and our culture. And that isn't the space I live in. So I think I'll hand over to someone that might be able to answer it better than me. But I think it's certainly about identifying the problem first. And that's what I'm flagging as the researcher who's identifying that there are some areas where, say, alpine landscapes, they are going to go extinct. They're on too smaller hills. Those hills are going to warm up too much and they're going to go extinct. So in terms of triaging them, maybe they're not the one that we should try and save. Maybe we use them as a place to save something else. But these are not my expertise. I'm flagging these as being an issue.
Vic, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in because it is more in my area of expertise, I guess. Having been involved with conservation biology over the last 20 years, this is something that has just grown and grown. But it's a really difficult question, and I don't think it's one that's going to be solved by a social scientist or an academic. It's going to have to be one that each local community is going to have to make their decisions on. We have to start with having information so that we can have those open conversations, so we can raise some of the things that Tom's been talking about. We do know that the world is changing, the natural environment's changing, and unfortunately there is going to be widespread losses of not just threatened species, but whole ecosystems and whole communities. And it's not necessarily going to happen gradually, as I said. It might happen very dramatically and quickly. So, we're already making decisions at the moment to try and to spend a lot of money, for example, putting irrigation drip lines around pencil pines in the World Heritage Area, which obviously brings with it a cost. At the moment, it's a really difficult conversation. It's a really difficult decision. And I think the conversation has to acknowledge that by doing nothing is actually making a decision. And that might be to say that we're just waiting for these things to disappear. But it is a really emotionally charged conversation. I've watched ecologists over the last couple of decades move from being conservation biologists to restoration ecologists, and that's quite a fundamental shift in values and paradigm. But it's definitely a conversation that the community needs to be involved in as we go forwards. And there's not going to be any simple, easy answer, I don't think.
Thanks, Pete.
David,
yes?
If I could just make a comment there that the TFS is currently, in Tassie, is currently going through a process of revising the bushfire risk mitigation plans for each fire management advisory committee area across the state. The model that's been going, we've been doing that for 12 months now. But one of the fundamental principles of that is identifying what are the assets at risk of bushfire. And the three assets we've looked at really are the ecological assets, those natural values that we see as Tasmania. We've got the duty to protect from bushfire, and obviously the economic assets, whether it be forestry, plantations, or industry, etc. and obviously the human settlement areas. So those three things we've spent 12 months trying in an extremely difficult model to try and put some sort of layer across for each local government area to identify what those assets are and how, to what degree they are threatened by fire. And I think that will form the basis between here and Christmas for each Fire Management Advisory Committee to make decisions about where priorities exist and what actions we can take before the event to allow some possible success in a catastrophic event to protect these assets. So it is something we're doing. Limited information, we're dealing with what we've got, but as Beck said, doing nothing is making a decision anyway. So we're working with what we've got. Thanks, John.
Now, I'm conscious we are almost at time. I would like to get one more quick question in from the panel. For Mike from the audience. And then we might just move to a concluding question for everybody. But Mike, for you, this is a question from Nina Rogers, who's a PhD student at UTAS. In your interview, you made a comment about the constraints you experienced of being employed by political leadership with views and policies that don't necessarily align to fire chiefs' observations and understandings of the climate science. With the benefit of time and reflection since you've left your job at TFS, what guidance could you offer to current and emerging executive leaders across the three levels of government on how to move beyond or around the political constraints to effective climate policy and action? And if I could ask you, I know it's a big question, but if I could ask you to be brief.
Yeah, big question. You're looking for a short answer.
Yeah.
The problem with the fire chief is they're a public servant. They're not the elected representatives. And the elected representative gets elected on a portfolio of policies and positions going forward. And there's nothing much you can do about that, except change your vote, I guess. So fire chiefs and any other public servant, I suppose, senior public servant is restricted in what they can say and do because it's got to align with policy and positions on government. All I can say is that when I was coming up with any program, any new policy, any special project that was looking for funding and support from government, is just make sure that your evidence and research is as thorough as it can be. Don't get emotive about it. Just put the facts on the table and ensure that that evidence is coming forward that's to support your program or decision you're coming up with. But that can be at times very difficult. And for the 30 of us retired fire and emergency services chiefs, we're now in a much better position where we've finished the job. We've been able to reflect back on what we've seen over the last decade or two, and we can say what we want. So I'm enjoying that. I'm enjoying that privilege at the moment. But yep, just make sure the research is clear and keep presenting the facts.
Thank you, Mike. I'm conscious we are now slightly over time, so I'm going to bring things to a close by asking each of you just very briefly. Well, thank you first of all for generously sharing your insights and time today. And in closing, I'd like to ask each of you, if you had to nominate just one thing that you think is critical to ensure that local governments can best support their communities to be prepared for future bushfire seasons, what would that thing be? Maybe we could start with Tom.
This might sound like a cop-out, but, properly funding local government to do this role. They're currently kind of trying to squeeze it in with everything else, but there's a lot of funding out there to try and support response, preparation, planning, and recovery activities, and focusing that down at the level where we know it is efficiently spent time and time again would be a great way of doing it. And we've got some great examples of how to do it well, such as what Hobart City Council have done. So I think we've got a basic scale of the budget we need, and just funding that, I think, would be a fantastic step forward for protecting us against the coming bushfire risks that we know will exist.
Thanks, Tom. David, what would you nominate?
What I would like to see is, because although I'm an academic, I get frustrated by abstracted conversations. I would like some demonstration sites of what adaptation looks like. I want to be able to take people or direct people to a suburb, to a landscape setting and say, all of the stuff you've heard about, go and have a look at it, go and experience it, walk around it, see it, feel it, think about it, reflect on it. That doesn't really exist. It's all just talk at the moment. We need to stop the talk and actually walk the walk. And, you know, I am, you know, concerned that I work on a university campus that could burn down. I'm trying to tell the university the campus is not even compliant. I live in suburbs that are not compliant. I spend my life walking around and driving around, seeing a building fire disaster, and I don't see a really simple solution that I could take people to, lead people to inspire them. All we have at the moment is talking about hypotheticals and future realities. We need to actually change as an emergency response. Just as we did with the virus, we need to change immediately and start the process of adaptation.
Thanks, David. And I just want to acknowledge we didn't get to a question from Pip from University of Tas, but she was actually suggesting, could fire safe home tours be part of sustainable homes open days or open garden open days? And I think that goes very much to your, you know, idea of practical, tangible things that people can go and see. So thanks, Pip, for that comment. Beck, what would you like to see?
I'd like to see decisions being made based on the information, on the science and the knowledge that we already know exists. I think when we've got groups like with Mike's group being ignored, that have the knowledge, they know what we should be doing, and yet we spent a lot of the last season talking again about the uncertainties, the things we didn't know, whether we can attribute a particular event, whether or not droughts can be directly linked to climate science. So I think that's what I would like. I'd like to just see, to use all of the knowledge and the science and the projections that we have, and to stop wasting time talking about whether or not climate change is an issue.
Thanks, Beck. What about you, John?
Look, it's an interesting one, and I think it's been a long part of, you know, I've worked in fire across the whole of the eastern seaboard as far as Queensland, and the people's attitude to fire varies the further south you go, and you have to look at the North Australian Fire Information Network to see what it is north of Brisbane and the difference between south. I think the critical issue, Beck and David have both made the point, that the most valuable thing that I've seen out in Tassie and Hobart particularly is the enlistment, the engagement, the cooperation between researchers and the fire service and council to discuss the issue, to tell people what we all know, and then move that discussion into what can we all do. And I think that that articulation of the issue and moving it towards a can-do scenario, this is the things that we can do, which will reduce our risk. I think that's the fundamental thing that will make a difference to community. As soon as you get involved in the bigger picture, you lose people at a local level. You've got to be able to tell people what you know. These are the facts. This is what it means to us locally in this street. This is what we can do in this street, on this house, on this block of land. People get it. And I know it's slow and it's tedious, but it produces an outcome. And I think that's the only way we're going to, it won't be dealt with by politicians at state level or federal level. It will only be dealt with by local communities, and we have to empower them to do it.
Thanks very much, John. And Mike, I'll give the last word to you.
Okay, just a couple of things there, and reflecting back on what Tom said there, we've got to be very honest with people and communities that this is inevitable. It's going to happen. And I recall back as Tom was talking, one of the better resources I've ever seen, and ABC used to have it on their website, were recordings of people that lived through a fire. They took the advice about staying at home and defending, and almost to a person, they've admitted later that they'd never do it again. It was absolutely terrifying. All sorts of things happened that they didn't expect, like the power going off, therefore their water supply went off, embers hitting their windows and other windows breaking and that sort of thing. So keep it real and make sure that that's reflected in the messaging that goes out, and build on keeping it local. So the most successful programs I've seen, and I actually went to one in Lennon Valley where there was a bushfire ready neighbourhoods presentation there with about 80 people. And if you keep it local, you're targeting it to that community type, that community risk. I've got friends that are at Clifton Beach and they'd been to one only a couple of years ago, and someone else at Mountain River too. And that is time consuming, and it's to a degree even tedious, but if you're going to really engage people, that's what's going to resonate with them. And the vehicle to do that is most certainly supported and provided by local government.
Thanks, Mike. Well, look, that really brings us to the end of our proceedings for today. I apologise we've run a few minutes over, but I think it's been, hopefully for everybody, a really useful and informative discussion. I'd like to thank all of our panellists for generously sharing their insights and their time today. As I say, I've really gotten a lot out of it, and hopefully you have too. We'll be making a recording of this session available so you can come back to it. You won't have lost any of the information if you haven't had a chance to capture it now. And also the resources that we prepared previously, interviews with all of our panellists and presentations and so on, will be part of that as well. We'll come back to you with a communication email with all of that, and probably also ask you for some feedback on today's event. Yeah, just in closing, I'd like to again thank everybody for attending and for participating, and certainly for those councils that are part of the Cities Power Partnership for joining today, and for those that aren't part of the Cities Power Partnership also for joining. And we'd love if you've enjoyed this event and you want to find out more about the program, you can certainly find it at our website. And also you can find information there about joining up as a local government if you're interested in doing that. So thank you again very much to everybody for attending. We hope you've gotten something out of the event, and we look forward to catching up with you again in the future. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.